So it's my very great pleasure to introduce you to Ingval Maxwell. That doesn't need an introduction in the world of architectural conservation, but the OB after his name, which means Officer of the Building of the British, not building, the British Empire, for his services to conservation. So is his contribution to conservation. So Ingval is an architect himself, and he was the head of Historic Environment Scotland. Actually, many people use now the publications that they produce, and he was the one who started them. So it was really, really substantial. When you talk about legacy, that's legacy for you. And they carry on publishing. He operates internationally, but also very active nationally, being the convener of the panel of Accreditation Architectural Conservation for the Royal Institute of Architects. A very long curriculum that you can see the program and various other places. I'll leave you.
Thank you. Well, professional accreditation. I came across this street philosopher's point of view, which I think is very relevant to conservation. Probably Gordon will recognize it, Stirling. The future lies before you like a field of fallen snow. Be careful how you tread, for every step will show. And that's true with conservation. And it's been true of conservation throughout ages, ever since we started being serious about conservation. But there are challenges along the way. We have, through the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, we've seen the construction industry, new build sector, pillage any conservation activity in the educational world, threatening the professional competence over a broad range of activities, threatening the technological abilities over a broad range of activities, and similarly, the vocational side. What are these broad range of activities? We've heard about the top end of the conservation needs in some of the opening addresses. But if I was to put the context of traditionally constructed buildings in numeric terms, in the United Kingdom, there are 6 million traditionally constructed properties that were built before 1919, of which 10% have been recognized by legislation. The irony is that all of them, generally speaking, have been constructed by the same panoply of materials. They've used the same skills to construct them. They have the same decay problems. They have the same conservation problems. And I use the word repair because arguably, if you look at it from repair and maintenance of structures, you almost get that word conservation automatically without thinking about it from a top-end approach. Bear in mind every step you take, comment earlier, how many of us actually now actively across that broad spectrum of the industry apply the thinking of the Athens Charter? How many of us actually apply the thinking of the Venice Charter? There was 30 years between them after all, difficult years admittedly, but arguably since the latest version that we should be thinking about, there have been equally difficult years. The difficult years where this loss, if you like, of the breadth of the understanding of what we need to look after the cultural heritage, both natural and built, is essential. Reflect just on a moment that anything and everything that we have ever built has either been sourced from below the ground or has grown on the top of the ground. It's nowhere else it's come from. It is fundamental, and it's fundamental in the challenges that we need to face. And looking at the two images on the screen at the moment, somebody at one point considered the right-hand view to be an effective solution. It's even on the left-hand view, look at the left-hand and right-hand part of the image and see how the character has been changed. The character has been changed because in the right-hand part, we now have a sea of mortar, as opposed to the tighter links of pieces of stone together on the left-hand part. Every step you take has got a challenge attached to it. So what to do about it? Well, we've had consistently references to the ICOMOS Education and Training Guidelines of 1993, and it's extremely gratifying that it is being given so much recognition so far in the program. But look at that strapline at the bottom of my image. Let me just read it. This relates to meetings which COTAC, then the Council on Training and Architectural Conservation in the UK, held in 1992, led by Bernard Fielding's paper, Multidisciplinary Collaboration in Conservation Projects in the UK, based on ICOMOS guidelines for education and training in the conservation of monuments, ensembles and sites, was presented to ICOMOS ITC CIF at its plenary meeting in Colombo on the 2nd of August 1993. And that paper included that chart on the lower right-hand side, where the then identified professional interests that emanated from the discussions that were held in 1992 were set against those 14 guidelines. And so Bernard's paper emphasized that 6 out of the 16 listed professionals should have a developed competence in all 14 guidelines. And it went on to imply that most of the others required at least 9 or 10 of the guidelines to be identified. That was a significant analysis in 1992 that I would argue is valid today, perhaps even more so, which I'll come towards the end of my presentation in exploring. 1993 was a formative year as well, because I qualified as an architect. I regret to say I haven't built anything. I became a civil servant and looked after and got engaged in a small team charged with caring for the built heritage and the guardianship of ancient monuments, scheduled monuments, listed buildings. But although I became a civil servant in 1969, I was an architect. And by 1993, as often happens in the civil service, reorganization, or should I say yet another reorganization, took place. And I was given the challenge of improving the quality and standards of architectural conservation work undertaken in Scotland in the setting up of Historic Scotland, the government's arm in Scotland, new division, Technical Conservation Research and Education Division. I did this by pursuing the 1993 ICOMOS and Education Guidelines. And looking at the guidelines, I suppose a gelatin area of conservation tastes, how to actually handle it. Clearly, a challenge like that in my job description was not possible on my own, or even with a very small team. Paragraph 5N of the guidelines is about working with others. So I set about setting up a number of liaison groups: conservation, training and education, stone liaison, traditional building liaison, fire liaison, cemetery and graveyard management liaison. I was able to work with colleagues in the civil service, paragraph 5H, to devise the application of building standards to traditional buildings, informal legislation, which the industry, the profession were obliged to follow. Paragraph 9, I worked internationally in setting up Cost Action C17, fire loss to the built heritage. But importantly, across virtually all of the guidelines, especially 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 paragraphs, I set up something called the Edinburgh Group on Professional Accreditation. What is it? It's an overarching pan-professional group of architectural conservation professional and institute bodies, including client, related interest, and governmental official heritage bodies located in the UK, the Isle of Man, the Republic of Ireland, and it did latterly include ICOMOS CIF. Since 2002, it has met 6 monthly in May and November to focus on considering the roles, benefits, and developments of all member body architectural conservation accreditation or certification schemes for the future well-being of the built heritage, its setting and environment. The group's mutual agreed purpose is to facilitate shared knowledge and experience in the field of architectural heritage conservation and to help enable the various peer-reviewed conservation accreditation schemes to operate with common principles. Well, what are these schemes? The first scheme was devised in 1992 by the Chartered Surveyors. Indeed, the Chartered Surveyors started talking about accreditation in 1988 as part of the move to have surveyor skills recognized in dealing with the built heritage effectively. But 1993 came along, as did the ICOMOS guidelines. And thereafter, there was a plethora of other schemes. In 95, the architects in Scotland joined. In 98, architects across the UK and architects accredited in building conservation emerged with their scheme. The Institute of Conservation, looking at the conservator world, brought in an accreditation scheme. Sean has identified, IHBC scheme kicked off after 2000. In the Republic of Ireland, a scheme came out in 2001. Conservation accreditation register for engineers in 2003. Engineer Ireland enjoyed the same year. The Chartered Institute of Architectural Technologists had a scheme that was launched in 2008. And the Royal Institute of British Architects, covering also the Society of Architects in Wales and those in Ulster, produced their scheme. The Chartered Institute of Building produced their scheme, certification they called it, in 2017. And in 2021, the Society of Chartered Surveyors of Ireland, a pan-professional grouping of accreditation schemes, all following the same underlying approach of the ICOMOS guidelines. The benefit of these should not be underestimated. The Edinburgh Group enabled discussion with the 4 home countries, England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, to actually look at what the professional role requirements might be for repair grant funding on projects funded by government grant aids. And in the tinted box in the center there, I just pick up some of the key issues. Accreditation of individuals rather than companies or practices. The scheme should be open to all suitably qualified and experienced members of the relevant professional disciplines. The assessment of a viable record of work carried out, demonstrating experience and competence. Assessment by suitably experienced impartial assessors against agreed criteria should be the basis of the scheme, and that it should use the ICOMOS education and training guidelines, and that an ethical and linked disciplinary framework should exist underneath that. This has been accepted by the various accreditation scheme professional bodies. And it is to be welcomed because it gives in the UK particularly official government blessing to the need for accreditation and the benefits that it would actually entail for the built heritage. And indeed, the Church of England, Church Care, has identified that accredited individuals should be appointed for work on their continual surveys of their church buildings in a note which came out a couple of years ago. The Four Home Countries project, identified there on the left, was launched in December 2016. So the need is very much alive. Within TCRE, Technical Conservation Research and Education Division, I did set about initiating research. The principle was, let's do some research into areas that we don't know much, some of the basic stuff of conservation, about lime, about traditional buildings, about decay, about how to actually carry out effective work. And over the period 93 to 2008, the small division enabled through many other efforts to at least produce one publication in accordance with each of the 14 guidelines to inform and instruct and to direct an awareness growing across the professional need. Most of these publications were available freely as part of the development to increase the operating quality and standards of work on the buildings, the traditional buildings, not just the high-end buildings, but the traditionally constructed buildings across the face of the country. But that was not all. There was a need to actually support the development of the accreditation schemes by a website of self-learning capability. And what was produced was 5 understanding conservation units, again based on the ICOMOS education training guidelines, translated and distilled into 5 self-learning units of architectural conservation understanding. This was developed with the support and agreement of the Edinburgh Group members and was launched in 2007. It was updated in 2015. I'll give the reason in a moment. And it was totally revised in 2021. The 4 units are cultural significance, aesthetic qualities and values, investigation, material technology, social and financial issues, and implementing management of conservation works. That is identified there on the blue column on the right-hand part of the screen. It was targeted to conservation professionals. The Understanding Conservation site was made freely available to all as part of the aim to enhance understanding and awareness of the issues. It was supported, as I noted, by the Edinburgh Group and to enhance any applications going into the various conservation accreditation schemes. But therein was a challenge. How can you be an expert immediately? Not possible. Or if you think it's possible, tread warily. There's a field of fallen snow in front. So let's think differently. The Council on Training Architectural Conservation, COTAC, then set about looking at how to build up that awareness from, if you like, a general lay audience, from a craft audience, from a school audience. I'm looking at the left-hand column at the moment, and develop that into students and what I might term general professionals before they can move on to conservation professionals by the understandingconservation.org site. And understand the general lay craft. It was identified as Insight 1. Let's create the need to appreciate the built heritage. And that's supported by online 5 units and 5 image sets, which, if they were walked through, should lead to an understanding of how to appreciate the built heritage. In the center, however, at the heart of it, is Insight 2, the need to be aware of the built heritage. And there sits the ICOMOS Education and Training Guidelines, particularly those identified with one-liners in paragraph 5A to N. And these are supported by 14 different image sets. Again, trying to emphasize the need and understanding of how to be aware of heritage matters. So reading from left to right, there was an intention there to try to broaden out the perspective of the learning process before you became the expert where you could apply to your professional body for accredited status. To give you an idea of what it looks like, this is Insight 1, a screenshot of the contents. Well, I'm not expecting you to read it, but at the end of it, having worked through relatively small amount of text, a lot of illustrations, purposely international, there is a green box of questions which are based on the text, which is supported by a pink box of answers. It's making it easy for people to go back and double check their understanding of what they've read and what they've interpreted. Because with many illustrations, one of the big challenges is, and I quote a phrase here I've used before, can you see what you're looking at? And that can be very difficult. This is trying to cut through that. In terms of the presentations of the ICOMOS guidelines in Insight 2, the need to be aware of set. At the top of them is the set of images which are annotated that address ICOMOS 5A, dealing with significance, and the bottom of the screen, that dealing with completing the process 5N. Again, 14 images or so per set. But we're talking in total about 210 annotated images which cover the 14 guidelines, all available free for download on the website, like the introductory volumes and the processes of them in the expanded volume, such as this, which is a screenshot of the content of Unit 1 on the Understanding Conservation part of the website. There, the blue boxes contain questions, but in part they're rhetorical. They're intended as practitioners read and work their way through the volumes, of which there are 5, to pose questions to make them think. Do I understand what I've seen? Do I understand what I've read? Do I understand a bit more about conservation that can help me become an expert? All freely available on the website. So how does all of that fit together? Well, the next 5 slides really take you through Unit 1, 2, 3, and 4, with on the left-hand top, the introductory volume. In the center, the relevant ICOMOS guidelines that apply to that volume, which equally apply to the Unit 1 of the Understanding Conservation volume as well. So that in the combination of Unit 1 with its image support, the images within the ICOMOS guidelines, the 9 out of the 14 that are relevant to both the, if you like, the elementary and the more guided and detailed Unit 1, 9 of the 14 are entombed within the approach to try to assist users contextualize their thoughts and approach to get this greater understanding of current conservation ethics. The same with approaches adopted in Unit 2, where 5 out of the 14 guidelines are threaded through both the left-hand and the right-hand PDF volume, which, as I keep saying, is available for free for download with the image sets. And so it goes on with Unit 3 as well. You know, how does the building work? What needs to be considered with investigation and materials and technologies with it? And here, 8 out of the 14 guidelines are threaded both in the left-hand and the right-hand volume. Unit 4, again, what needs to be thought about, bringing in consideration of being skilled in social and financial issues. And in this case, again, 9 of the 14 guidelines thread left and right. So that there's a read across, as the diagram as I identified earlier tried to reveal across the available online material for those interested in pursuing. Unit 5, what do we do to affect the heritage? You know, how do we implement and manage the conservation work? In this case, 7 out of the 14 ICOMOS guidelines feed left and right and inform, I think, the text in either side, coupled with the supplementary image set associated with Insight 1 approach. But Sean has also mentioned the other element that is relevant to the UK with the British Standard Publication 7913, which replaced an earlier version that was produced in 1998. This new version dates to 2013. It looks at description of buildings, architecture, conservation history, significance, conservation principles, values, heritage management values, what about historic areas, condition surveys, inspections, investigations, the pathology of these, common defects, common repairs, new developments, adaptation, maintenance, sustainability, energy efficiency, project management, supervision, and finally with dealing with competence and accreditation. There were many involved in the production of this British standard, which are informative. Its core drafting was carried out by representatives from the 4 home countries who signed up to the protocol of accreditation, as well as other professional bodies. It involved a range of disciplines: architects, engineers, surveyors, archaeologists, builders, and town planners. And its release in 2014 led to the update revision of the 5 online understanding conservation units in 2015. So they are, if you like, informed also by the British standards. And in paragraph 13 of the British standard, it refers to Annex A, in that the standard's informative Annex A notes that a number of conservation accreditation schemes exist across the face of the country, and acknowledges IHBC's role in that as well. These conservation schemes essentially are the ones that go into the Edinburgh Group consideration and are routinely reported on in the 6-monthly cycle with feedback from others in the meetings of the Edinburgh Group. What of the professional body's recognition of what is available on the COTAC website, freely available, I repeat? Well, CIA, the Chartered Institute of Architectural Technologies, do promote regularly this as relevant CPD, continuing professional development, for their members. And this is just screenshots from their website. The RIBA, in their accreditation scheme, which Christina referred to, the criteria for that is based on the education and training guidelines. And the principle of conservation work should be entrusted to persons competent and skilled in these activities. Not all can be skilled at once, hence the COTAC support site. The Conservation Register informed on the detailed process of how to apply, and the adjacent volume, Conservation CPD Pathway, illustrates where CPD is available to support the application process. Many of what I've talked about by COTAC is included in that path reference with the arrows identified. The RIBA has gone a little bit further and commissioned me to actually prepare another set of 14 images to reveal the ICOMOS guidelines in a bit more detail, to try to encourage the adopting them across the professional members. This is a screenshot again of what the content of that guideline A looks at. There's about 40 slides in each, so 40 times 14 is a lot of online information illustrated and annotated. At the end of it, there is also a bibliographic link, as well as a summary awareness of what that particular guideline means. The IBA scheme has two levels. Also recognizes there is a need for an introductory level conservation registrant who is expressing an interest in conservation. But the formality of the schemes deal with assessing conservation architects or specialist conservation architects. And Sean touched on this from IHBC's point of view as well. The RIBA also have a skills matrix that draws a distinction between the CA and the SCA in an overview of what each particular level deals with. What difference is there in their knowledge and application, differences in the standard of work that's identified, and how they deal with their autonomy, how the individuals cope with complexity, and how they have a perception of the context within which they are working. Again, the COTAC material aims to support this approach, and the difference as presented by the skills matrix actually gives individuals a greater awareness of their own experience as to where they sit within the pecking order of developmental knowledge in conservation accredited status. So let me just return to Sir Bernard's chart and reflect on what I've talked through in terms of the three layers of becoming aware, through appreciation to become skilled in. With the online material that sits across all of that area, is there not a capability by looking at the skills matrix a little bit more seriously to recognize that to get on the track of being effective in dealing with conservation, you've got to accommodate the novice. You've got to accommodate the advanced beginner. You've got to recognize the development of competence and the development of knowledge, appreciation, awareness, to become understanding in conservation at an expert level. So let me just propose something at the moment. Since 1993, as the conservation sector has grown, and indeed through the various conservation accreditation schemes in the UK and Ireland, there are now, I think, over 9,000 individuals who have been through a peer review assessment process. And you pitch that 9,000 increased knowledge, awareness, and understanding against 60 million properties that are needing a greater degree of sensitivity in how to deal with the work. So there are many other areas of activity that conservation now feeds into. That's in the bullet point there under the item 1, slightly hidden by the banner at the top. But the idea is, perhaps, might it be possible for each of these bullet pointed areas of employment to identify what jobs are actually focused on conservation? Might it be possible to consider these jobs against the 14 guidelines in much of the way that St. Bernard did in 1993 paper to the ICOMOS CIF? And if that is the case, might the freely available online material of Insight 1, Insight 2, and Understanding Conservation help a growing appreciation and knowledge of that broader perspective of jobs that are involved in not just World Heritage Site, not just listed buildings, but the broader perspective of the built heritage that requires some degree of appreciation and understanding to make effective decision-making in the work that is carried out. I fall back on 1993, paragraph 4, and quote, "There is a need to develop a holistic approach to our heritage on the basis of cultural pluralism and diversity, respected by professionals, craftspersons, and administrators." It goes on, "Conservation requires the ability to observe, analyze, and synthesize." What I think I've tried to set out, at least from a limited UK perspective, but based upon the international dimension of the ICOMOS guidelines, is that there is a broader way to be looking at this, to address that wider audience that has an interest in conservation. And perhaps, just perhaps, the framework that has been adopted, I think successfully, by the various professional bodies who run accreditation schemes in the UK and the Republic of Ireland, might have a resonance in other places. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ingval. Any question for Ingval? I think this was very detailed. Again, the same that with the baseline of how you start doing the learning, we have to connect really, which I don't think at the moment is that well connected, the learning outcomes of university courses or other courses with the accreditation. It's this basis of the guidelines, but I think we should make more direct connection, because ultimately it's that. So it's no having different measurements. I think this measurement system, when, for example, in the UK, we have the courses, we have to present the very clear learning outcomes, so the students are aware they are being assessed on that. And I think forward, what you say about first identifying the areas that we need to learn about, fundamental, and grow the knowledge of them and make that freely available, as you are doing. This is quite exemplar, which not everybody does. And I think one of the problems we have is the pollution, as I call it, of publications, because there are lots of publications, but the ones that are worth, you have to really be reading lots, so they make a proper reading list for students to read. And I think we need to create this more robust, this kind of, it's a peer review, but it's also the linkages between the education. And I think the young people that we keep talking about, I think that hopefully in the afternoon we will hear more their voices as well. So thanks so much again.
I think it's about inclusivity and identifying within that broader perspective where you are, no matter what you're providing, and how you may be able to spread that up and down the ladder of developmental understanding. Yeah, and
be more scientific, because I think Javier and also Nurdan, when you were talking about Professor, that he was calling for more scientific approach. And I think it's also, we have Professor Carbonara, I think he will agree that we need more scientific approach. I was talking about evidence before, but also, identify what is the part I'm going. I think we have many courses that they try to cover everything, and it's just all very, very thin and very spread out. And you have this, and you all have the experience of going around and finding these people with a very thin coating of heritage that is not in-depth education and training, which is what we need to produce. Rosine, you have a question?
I just actually want to compliment Ingval on his presentation and to say that these particular points that you're bringing through about inclusive.
Okay, sorry, Rosine, can you come here, because I think the people online cannot hear you.
Things are being recorded, so.
Now you're going to say something different.
Yeah. And no, I just want to thank Ingval on his fantastic presentation, and to say that he's the reason I became a conservation architect, because when I first started conservation, I was dealing with a street in Dublin that was falling down, that had been knocked down because the Irish people couldn't accept the connection with England, and we had no information on how to save these buildings, and the only information I got was from those first publications from Ingval that he was describing, and that's what got me interested. And it's also why I'm now an assessor with the RIBA. It's following Ingval, because I think this whole point about sharing our information, putting it up for free, and we don't know who's going to read it, and hopefully it'll save a building somewhere else. And so I want to thank Ingval for his work. He's been a huge inspiration.
Yeah, I think that is